Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Bockel. I'm the co-executive director of NJ 11th for Change. Welcome to tonight's important Defending Democracy panel discussion about redistricting in New Jersey. Everyone can say hello to Mara Novak, our other co-executive director, who's making sure everything runs smoothly for us, and our field director, Stacy Abenstein, who will be helping to share any questions that you have. Just put them in the chat section so we can share them with our panelists at the end of the presentation. NJ 11 for Change believes that government should be transparent, responsive, and accountable. And we think it's crucial that constituents like all of us are educated about the important issues of the day so we can be responsible voters. If you agree, we hope you'll visit our website. The link is in the chat to join our grassroots team or even make a donation to support the civic education work we're doing here tonight. So please check the chat. Now, to talk about redistricting, every 10 years after the census, states go through a redistricting process. It's happening right now. The lines of our federal congressional districts are redrawn, and the lines for our state legislative districts are redrawn. In New Jersey, it's two separate processes. Everyone, citizens and politicians alike, have an interest in how this process works and how those lines are redrawn. For politicians, it's an opportunity to create districts for themselves that are more or less friendly to them as candidates, to pick their own voters, so to speak, to gerrymander and possibly disenfranchise entire demographic groups. For citizens, it's the opportunity to fight for fairer representation or to find ourselves potentially shifted from one district to another, which can be good or can be bad depending on our interests. Tonight, we'll be hearing from three panelists who are deeply informed about the 2021 redistricting process in New Jersey. Marcia Marley of Blue Wave NJ. Hi, Marcia. Matt Duffy of New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Hi, Matt. And Peter Chen of New Jersey Policy Perspective. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I'd like to hand the mic to Marcia, who will explain to us the basic nuts and bolts of the redistricting process.
Hello, everyone. I'm sharing my screen and can everyone see it? All right. I'm going to begin tonight by providing an overview of what the redistricting process is and how it has been abused to the benefit of a political party. But to understand that, you need to know why is redistricting important, because it will determine which party controls Congress as well as the majority of state legislatures for the next 10 years. And understand how redistricting works, you need to know the key questions. First of all, what has the authority or who has the authority to draw the map? How are they chosen? What criteria are they required to use? How transparent and inclusive is the decision process? Gerrymandering usually happens in back rooms. So we advocate for transparent, open, and inclusive decision processes. It's complicated. Why? Because each state does its own thing. The criteria sometimes conflict with each other. And there are very few federal rules. So let's look first at who has control of redistricting. Who has the authority to draw the map? In 25 states, the legislature controls the map and controls the process. In 34 states, they have some authority over it. And even in some, like in New Jersey, which is called a commission, an independent commission, they still have authority. This is the primary reason we have partisan gerrymandering. Essentially, what it does gives the fox the responsibility of guarding the hen house. Legislature and the legislators are usually very happy to pack their own party's districts, their own districts, and crack those of their opponents. Who doesn't want a safer district? For those states who, where the state legislature has control over redistricting, it is easy to understand why partisan gerrymandering is so tempting, but also so pernicious. Democracy should not rely on a system where the legislators pick their constituents. It is supposed to be the other way around. Given the obvious bias of having legislators pick their own districts, the good news is that the trend is towards a fairer system. It is a slow trend, but the trend is creating a separate nonpartisan commission with map drawing authority. There are currently 13 states with commissions. Not all of them are nonpartisan. They have authority to draw the map. New Jersey is one of those states. Moreover, more states in 2021 will be using nonpartisan commissions. However, before you conclude that all redistricting commissions are a good thing, there are different types of commissions, as described in the next slide. First, let's look at bipartisan commissions. That's what we have in New Jersey. It gives equal voice to either party in the redistricting process, even if one party dominates. As Representative Sherrill said last week, we have a democratic, overwhelmingly democratic state with a bipartisan commission that gives equal weight to the minority party. That's true, all right? But bipartisan is not nonpartisan. A nonpartisan commission is one where third parties or independents can get at least more than one seat, or where the partisan makeup is not specified. For example, Missouri is considered a nonpartisan commission. It shouldn't be. Why? Because while the partisan nature is not specified, it consists of the governor, the commission does, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General. If they all belong to the same party and report to the governor, that certainly is not nonpartisan. So labels can be confusing. The two other commission definitions relate to whether incumbents can be on the commission. Non-politician commissions are commissions where members cannot hold elective office. Example, Washington, D.C. Politician commissions, members can hold elective office, and that's New Jersey. All right. Good example of politician commission. So we're again back to the foxes guarding the hen house with New Jersey, or any commission that allows politicians, existing politicians, to be on the commission and redraw their own districts. While New Jersey redistricting is done by a commission, it is a political or politician commission, and it is bipartisan rather than nonpartisan. The Fair Redistricting Coalition has lobbied for a nonpartisan, non-politician citizen commission that represents the diversity of our state. That's also not the case. Once the commissioners are picked, which is basically where we stand in New Jersey, what are the criteria used and how should they be changed to produce a fair result? If we look at the next slide, and I realize this is a little crowded on this slide, but I want to examine first existing criteria. Federal, equal population in each district. If you look at existing principles for states, you have compactness. You can see how many states have 37 at the state level. Congressional is 18. It means minimum distance between all parts of a constituency. Contiguity, I would call it connectedness. All parts of a district are connected to each other. I think it's a much better definition. All right, that there's a way to connect all parts of the district. You don't have to go out of the district to get to another part of it. Let's look at preservation of political subdivisions. Districts should not split counties, cities, or towns. I just want to use as an example Montclair. It's split between the 10th and the 11th districts. According to this criterion, it should be united. But that could conflict with the principle of preserving minority representation, since the South Ward of Montclair is majority Black and in Payne's district, as is the 3rd Ward. That takes us to the next principle, preservation of communities of interest. Districts should not be split. They shouldn't split residents with common political interests. The next section on this is a very compact table, but the next section you can see is merging criteria. And these are the principles and lists of criteria recently implemented in several states to ensure a nonpartisan map and process. These include rules against favoring or discriminating against the candidate, incumbent, or party, and in a few cases, a prohibition on using partisan data at all. The third criteria is an effort to increase competitiveness in each district. For example, in Arizona, there's a criterion that states if a more competitive district map exists, it should be selected. I ran out of room on this table to put another criterion, proportionality, that will be used in the states of Missouri and Ohio starting in 2021. Proportionality means that the statewide proportion of districts whose voters favor each political party shall correspond closely to the statewide preferences of the voters over the next 10 years. So many of these criteria are not consistent. They conflict with each other. You can't really, I think, fulfill all of them. Now, if we turn to the next slide, I list a selection of principles advocated by good government groups. These principles include protect communities of color, requirements for decision-making process, transparency, public access, participation, establish an independent citizen commission whose members reflect the diversity of the state, more public hearings. We are asking for 12 hearings for the congressional map. It's mandated of 3. I think we'll be lucky to get 6 or 7. Hopefully. Ban partisan gerrymandering. I'm going to get back to that one. But first I want to talk about elimination of prison gerrymandering, because that's important in many states. And in New Jersey, we did pass successfully a law in 2020 and 21, where inmates will be counted in their pre-incarcerated home district. But that's also delayed some of the both legislative and congressional maps and data. So let's go back to gerrymandering, ban partisan gerrymandering. This is one of the most important goals. As I said, gerrymandering is really easy for most legislators if they decide the map. It's hard for them not to do it. And many groups, including the Brennan Center and others, are establishing strategies and criteria to include the establishment of nonpartisan commissions, rules to eliminate protection of incumbents, as well as map drawing tools to prevent such practices. I want to take an aside on gerrymandering just for a minute. The two primary forms of gerrymandering are racial and partisan. Racial gerrymandering is the intentional manipulation of the redistricting process to reduce the political power of a certain racial group. Partisan gerrymandering is the intentional manipulation of the redistricting process to benefit a single party. Both types of gerrymandering are often linked. In striking down parts of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court refused to stop partisan gerrymandering. The League of Women Voters gives an excellent, really excellent example of how these two types of gerrymandering are and can be linked. In 2016, the Republican majority in North Carolina redrew the legislative districts after the US Supreme Court deemed the 2011 maps unlawful. You probably remember when that happened. When redrawing the maps, the largest historical Black college in the country, North Carolina A&T State University, was split into two different districts, thereby diluting the students' power. This is a gerrymander that targets the political power of a racial group for the benefit of a political party in power, and happens too often. So basically, that's an overview of redistricting, gerrymandering, and the different types of commissions and authority involved in the drawing of maps. Now I want to talk about actually what happens in New Jersey. So after throwing all the information at you in definitions, let's look at the next two slides about what happens actually in our state. And these are from the Brennan Center. So first is who draws the districts. State redistricting process. Just ignore the 80 House seats and substitute 80 Assembly seats. This was their discussion, and for every single state, they used House for the Assembly or lower legislative House. The Commission for the Redistricting of the State Legislature is called the Appointment Commission. The state Democratic and Republican chairs each pick 5 members, and then, if no agreement is reached on the 11th member, the Chief Justice will pick the tiebreaker, still to be announced. We haven't heard anything about it. The only mandatory considerations for picking commissioners is geography. There's none other. As pointed out earlier, the New Jersey Appointment Commission is a politician commission. There are current or past office holders on the apportionment committee, such as Steve Sweeney, our Senate President, Leroy Jones, our chair of the Democratic Party, Tom Brannick, who's Republican, and Tom Kane Jr., who is running for Congress, but also in the legislature. While there are no public meetings required, they have been held in the past. Again, we would like to see 12 such meetings. I have no idea how many they're going to hold. And it would be nice to have these rules laid down, that they have to have 6, 12 meetings, etc. Right now, it's there's no guideline whatsoever. The criteria for the appointment commission includes compactness, connectedness, and preservation of political boundaries. not a lot. So if we go to the congressional redistricting, if you look at that, you can see that the Congressional Redistricting Commission consists of 12 members, 6 from each party, 2 picked by the minority and majority leaders of the state legislature, and 2 from each of the state party chairs. Commissioners must be selected with due consideration to geographical, ethnic, and racial diversity, and may not be a member or employee of the U.S. Congress. The chairperson must have resided in the state for at least 5 years and cannot have held office during that time. If the commissioners can't agree on a 13th member or tiebreaker, the person is chosen from the names submitted to the state Supreme Court by the 2 parties. At the beginning of August, the New Jersey Supreme Court picked John Wallace as a tiebreaker. That was the name submitted by the Democratic commissioners. While the Congressional Commission must hold at least 3 public hearings in different parts of the state, we would like to see at least, again, 12. Hopefully we'll get 6. And I urge all of you to testify in front of both the Apportionment Committee, State Legislative Committee, and the Congressional Redistricting Commission. The Congressional Redistricting results must be reported by January 18th. That's coming up. There's not a lot of time for having public hearings. And the reapportionment results, state legislature must be reported by March the 1st. I think that's right. Also note that given the bipartisan nature of the commissions, as well as our current partisan climate, it is unlikely that Republicans and Democrats will agree to support one map, meaning the map will be chosen by the tiebreaker and may rotate between the Democratic and Republican options. That can be problematic. In the 2011 redistricting process, the tiebreaker picked the Republican congressional map. When I started to work actively on a number of congressional districts and campaigns, New Jersey's congressional delegation was evenly split with 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. Even though we're a strongly Democratic state, we were evenly represented. The current breakdown is 2 Republicans and 10 Democrats because of activists. All right, I'm going to come back and talk about the political considerations, but first I'm going to turn it over to Matt Duffy at NJISJ, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, to talk about what we as activists are advocating for. Matt?
First of all, hello, everyone. I'm Matt Duffy. I'm the new special counsel for redistricting for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I apologize that the glare makes it look like I don't have eyes and instead I'm wearing glasses that are just a computer screen. I think it's very cool in like an 80s chic Max Headroom type of way, but I'll work on finding a less glare-filled video screen in the future. I also have slides to share, so you won't have to look at my mug for very long. Thank you so much, Marcia, for the wonderful overview of all the redistricting stuff and your deep knowledge of the ways these partisan commissions or bipartisan commissions have worked in the past. I'm going to share a little bit. There'll be some overlap, but we're going to talk a little bit about what we think as advocates. And the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, or the Institute, we have our own perspective of what we view a good map as and what we want out of this process. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what we hope, as well as sort of what is at stake here and why we want you to get involved. So let's see, 2 seconds. So this is, again, a lot of this is going to be a recap, but I think it's worthwhile just to hammer this point in for everyone. Redistricting is about power. One of my colleagues, Hennel at the Institute, likes to say that redistricting is possibly the most political thing that we do, even over other aspects of politics, because redistricting is deciding what politics is going to look like for the next 10 years. who runs for office is dependent upon where we draw districts. I know in New Jersey 11, Mikey Sherrill is sort of at the border of the district. If the lines were drawn slightly differently, she might never have run for Congress when she did. It definitely changes who is elected by changing sort of who the voters are, and even what policies are adopted, because we can see the different ways that lines have been drawn, elect different people, means if policies get lifted up. We'll talk a little bit about that in a way in the future. So a fair map is really essential to making sure that you have your voice heard, right? You can vote, but if we have a map that is not fair, that has split up your community or divided things in a way that don't give you a voice, it's going to make it really difficult for all the political participation you can put together to break through that. So we need to make sure we're getting this right. And what's really important, I think, for us to all pay attention to in New Jersey is that this state has changed so much in the last 10 years. I know Peter's going to talk a little bit about this, but over 48% of New Jerseyans are now people of color, up from 40% in 2010. And right now, our maps do not reflect that. They're not centered as much on our really large and growing communities of color. So we at the Institute feel like that is a major thing that needs to change in the next redistricting cycle. Again, I'm going to very briefly go over this because I know Peter's going to go over it. But yeah, big shift since 2010. Asian residents and Latinx residents have particularly grown quite a bit. A lot of our cities have grown quite a bit. So that's going to mean that some people are going to have to, some districts are going to have to shrink, some districts are going to have to grow. And this makes New Jersey, according to the Census Diversity Index, one of the most diverse states in the country, more diverse than New York, Florida, or Georgia. So just making sure that when we have a legislature and when we have maps, they reflect that sort of inheritance that we're bringing and the way that our population actually is. So if we don't get involved, I talk about this, what is at stake, but it's really what happens if we do nothing? What happens if we sort of like sit back and let the commission take over, look at the data on their own and draw the maps that they want? What we can see is, particularly in New Jersey, where you have a political but bipartisan process, people can meet behind closed doors and make a decision that does not necessarily reflect what the residents in New Jersey believe maps should reflect. And this still happens. I think still even in New Jersey, there's a day after all the public meetings where the commissions get a hotel somewhere and they just go into a room and they just try to hash it out. So we need to make sure that they hear us before then and that they have us in their heads when they wind up going to that sort of in a hotel conference room, drawing the final maps that are going to affect our politics in our state for the next 10 years. And the big thing, again, is that they shouldn't be cutting up your neighborhoods. Marcia talked about this, the politicians sort of cutting up your neighborhoods to suit their needs. We don't want to see that. We won't want to see politicians sort of dividing you from where you live and from people who you view as your community in order to benefit themselves in whatever way they can, to make their seat safer, to improve their incumbency, to make a political favor for someone. We want to make sure that they're listening to the residents in New Jersey, and that is their main criteria when they're drawing these maps. So that's sort of, you can tell probably from that what I think a good map looks like. It'll run through again these next slides super quickly because Marcia did a great job covering them. Things that are required, of course, are population. So the graph on the left, you can see, doesn't have the same number of people. The reason we redraw these districts is to make sure the districts have the same number of people. They have to all share a common border. So you can't have a little bit of District 11 here as an island completely separate away from the rest of it. You have to have it where you have the same amount of people in a district that shares one common border, which sometimes means that you need to have some districts be much bigger because fewer people live there, and some districts be much smaller because it's an urban area and much more people live in a smaller space. We also, New Jersey, require or say that they shouldn't where they couldn't, and this isn't true for congressional, but definitely true for legislative, shouldn't cut up towns or counties. So you shouldn't be able to cut someone's town in half if you can't, unless it's of a certain size. And they should be drawn so that residents live closely together. So you're not trying to have any of those snake districts. You want to draw them in a way so that the people who live in that district live closely together. Those are required. But then some other things we want to keep in mind. Communities of interest, definitely a thing that we think is the most important, or one of the most important at the Institute. It's not required in New Jersey, but sort of a group of people who believe that they are part of the same community, irrelevant to what if they're fitting in a town line or if they're sort of compact. It's possible they could be spread out. It's possible they could be all bunched together. They could be across several towns. But if the people who live there feel that their community extends in a certain way, we think the map should reflect that. Because you want to make sure that those people have a representative they can go to and feel like they have a way to get their concerns across to an elected representative. And then I was also talked about partisan fairness, which is, we don't want politically gerrymandered maps, but we also need to make sure we know that partisan fairness doesn't always mean fairness. You can draw maps that are proportional, but that you have the two parties are very satisfied with, but the residents of the state are not. If you're drawing maps where the political party is still splitting up communities in a way that keeps them from their voice, right? A party is not a community necessarily. They can represent it, but our theory again is that that's because the community has power and it's been sort of put in a good district. That's what we think a fair map is. Right? A fair map puts communities together so that they have a voice and they can influence a politician. So let's say you have a community of people and they are in a food desert, right? They do not have good food options where they live. They share a lot of connections, interpersonal connections, business connections, cultural connections. They are a community of interest and they have a need, right? They have this food desert that they want addressed. If you put them together in a district in a way that empowers them, then they have a representative that needs to listen to them, right? That representative has to listen to them, or there's a possibility that representative could lose election, right? It could still remain a safe blue or red district potentially, but that elected representative knows that if it's not listening to this community, they might not be able to win election or not. So the politician responds to the people because the people are put in a district that empowers them to have their needs sort of put across. And then that turns into laws. That turns into the representative going up there and saying, look, I have a food desert in my district. These people are saying that we need to fix this and I need to get it done. So the alternative is that you cut up those communities, right? And they would still be represented. They would still be in districts. But now there's no common community within one district with the need shared. So you have 3 representatives. There are a few people in the district, but not really enough that they need to pay attention to, who have this issue and they don't necessarily need to listen to them. So we don't want to see that happen. We want to see that we are keeping communities together in order to make sure that these concerns can be lifted up and that politicians will listen to the residents of those areas. That's where I'm stopping. Stop.
Okay. Matt, are you all set?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So so Peter, would you be able to speak a little bit about what we learned from the census this year and how that could or might affect redistricting in New Jersey and how it affects how we prioritize things?
Sure, happy to. So hi, everyone. Peter Chen here, Senior Policy Analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspective. In my prior role at Advocates for Children of New Jersey, I coordinated the statewide census outreach effort for nonprofits. So I have lots of census-related knowledge now. Let me set up my slides here, and then I'll share my screen. So I'll try to keep things brief. And I was actually wondering, I know there's a lot more chatting to do, but I'm wondering if folks do have questions about some of the stuff, because it is sometimes very technical. But I'll go through my presentation relatively quickly. Let's start with the basics on census. As was mentioned, every 10 years, the Constitution requires that every person in the United States be counted for the purposes of congressional apportionment. So the decennial census determines the number of seats you get in Congress, as well as, wait, did I share the right screen? Are you seeing this? Okay. The federal funding that states get as part of different formulas, not just states, but municipalities, counties, etc. So for example, all of the federal funding that just went out as part of the American Rescue Plan was distributed based on 2010 census figures. They did not have the 2020 census figures yet when those came out. And then planning data. And this goes to what Matt was alluding to before about things like planning where supermarkets are, etc. All right, so let's go through the basic population changes. This is a lot of numbers and a lot of words on a screen. So don't worry if you don't there won't be a quiz. The total population in New Jersey, though, this top line number is worth flagging, which is that the total population increased by about 6% in, let's see, 6% since 2010. And that's substantially better than we were expecting. The previous sort of estimates had us at no growth or maybe 1%. So this is great for New Jersey. It meant that we saved our congressional seat and actually got pretty close to getting back our 13th congressional seat. You may have heard, and Matt alluded to this as well, that the non-Hispanic white population in the state has declined. But I do want to flag that there's also large growth in the two groups, some other race and more than one race. And so people who may previously have identified as white may have identified as some other race for the purposes of the census. So for example, somebody who is, I don't know, let's say somebody is Syrian. Traditionally on the census, they were asked to respond as Caucasian white because the Middle Eastern populations were often counted as white. And a lot of groups were not comfortable with this. There was discussion about including a Middle Eastern, North African racial group. The Trump administration did not opt to include the new group, so they were sort of left with no group to put in. And so they may have opted for some other race, whereas previously they might have put in white. So I just want to be careful with that. I think some of the conversation around non-Hispanic white population decline is a little bit overblown. Simply because we're seeing a rise in these other more complex categories. And I think part of the story here is that race and ethnicity are much more complicated than just, you know, four or five groups, that people have much more complex views of their own racial and ethnic heritage than that alone. But the other big story here is the growth in Asian and Hispanic populations, which you see Asian populations grew by about 31%, Hispanic Latinx populations grew by about 29%. So, you know, each group grew fairly substantially. Okay. All right, so why does this matter? We already talked about this, but the one thing that's important to flag here is the principle of one person, one vote. And this is why the census numbers matter so much for drawing district lines. The districts all have to be roughly equal in population, and roughly equal in population as far as their census 2020 decennial census population count. And so that means a lot of districts are going to have to change their borders in order to adjust. So if we look at the general trends of growth, you know, we see a lot of growth along the sort of turnpike corridor. Most of the growth in the state concentrated there in, you know, Hudson, Essex, Union, Middlesex, Somerset, and Mercer, with the outlier there of Lakewood, which had huge growth in Ocean County, but the rest of the county really did not have substantial growth. And we're also seeing declining population and slow growth in rural areas. I don't think anyone's shocked to see that Sussex County, you know, declined in population, but Cumberland County, for example, between 2000 and 2010 was the 6th or 7th fastest growing county, and now actually declined in population by almost 2%. So there are some substantial changes. I think if we were going to say what's the general trend in population from 1950 to 2010, it would have been lower proportional population in New Jersey in urban areas and increasing in suburban and then increasingly in exurban areas. You know, Hunterdon, Warren, Cumberland, Atlantic, and that's reversed in this census. You're seeing people coming back to sort of the urban agglomerations, especially the urban areas around New York City, where I myself reside. So, you know, there you go. But, you know, for the 11th, I think there are real questions about how those lines are going to move to adjust to the population changes that we're seeing. And I believe the 11th is going to have to shave some population off of its total, and we'll have to lose some towns in order to remain at its ideal size. So actually, that may be wrong. I think it has to grow slightly. I'll check. So what does this mean for a district? Remember, one person, one vote. So districts that had population increases bigger than the state total will have to get smaller, and districts with population decreases will have to get bigger, right? They'll have to glom on new towns and neighborhoods in order to get to a fair size. So the ideal district size here is we have 774,000 for congressional districts and 232,225 for legislative. But importantly, you can't split towns in legislative districts other than Jersey City and Newark. So by the end of this, you may very well not live in the 11th district. That is something to sort of keep in mind with this process. So I want to talk briefly about packing and cracking. These are sort of two terms that are used for the ways in which the lines can be moved. And I think this is helpful just for thinking about what it means to sort of have these district lines cut through communities. So, just a rough definition, right, is that a group can gain political advantage by moving those district lines around certain populations to create advantageous situations for themselves. So packing is creating a lopsided district with the disfavored group as the strong majority, and then cracking is spreading them out over multiple districts. And that usually results in dilution of minority group representation. So I have this handy diagram from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which is helpful. So these are the same dots on both screens. But in the first image, you can see that the purple folks have been packed primarily into this central district, leaving the 5 surrounding districts to have majority green populations. Now, in the alternative world in which purple is in charge, they can cut the district down the middle to ensure that that concentrated population in the middle is spread out among the different districts, getting some districts that are purple and some that are green. They are roughly evenly distributed for the purpose of this exercise. I think it's 31 green and 29 purple. But it just shows you, right, like how even with the same basic census numbers, right, you can cut districts in different ways in order to render these kinds of results. And I don't necessarily know if either any of these answers is necessarily quote unquote right or wrong, because there may be other factors here. The point is to know sort of how this process can be manipulated, and that the creation of majority minority districts has historically been one way that both that minority groups can receive representation, right, because they can finally be a majority of the population in a district, but is also a way of packing and diluting the political power of that minority group by preventing them from having a say elsewhere. Okay, so just to sort of wrap things up on the census side, the concentration in the urban growth is going to shift power north and east, generally speaking. As those districts have to get smaller because they're smaller in population, other districts are going to start sticking their sort of tendrils over into those areas to try to glom up that population and even out their population size. The growing Asian and Hispanic populations, Hispanic Latinx populations are difficult to manage for the purposes of trying to ensure effective representation, because oftentimes they're diffuse among districts. So an Asian population that's a growing part of the state, but that is spread out as between 10 and 20% of most districts, of many districts, it is not necessarily going to rise to the level of receiving effective representation. So there's some question about how best to ensure that those populations are represented. And one last thing to really keep in mind is that the district lines and the district populations are about the census decennial population, not necessarily voting eligible population. So importantly, about 800,000 residents in New Jersey are non-citizens, so they're not eligible to vote. And the child population is also ineligible to vote. So areas where there are younger populations, so for example, your Hudson, your Essex, your Ocean counties, because of Lakewood, those areas are going to have, they may have disproportionately higher political power, but they may not necessarily represent well the populations that they're serving, because those populations can't vote. So that's something to keep in mind as well when thinking about this process. So that's a sort of broad overview, and I'll stop there because I know we have a lot to get through.
Thanks, Peter. I think, Marcia, are you going to speak next about sort of the politicization of this and how all of the political interests in our state are likely to try to address these changes in the census data?
Let me share my screen. I'm coming up. Can you see this map? Everyone, okay. Now that you probably have know a little more than you ever wanted to know about redistricting and all the different terms, and you're brought up to date on the census, let's examine how redistricting could change New Jersey's congressional landscape. Today, I want to focus on the Congressional Commission rather than the Legislative Commission, because first, and most importantly, the congressional reports first, it has to be out by January. And secondly, we do not have time to discuss the political permutations of the apportionment committee. It would take several hours. So this map here is from 538 Redistricting Project that was published in early 2018. However, the look of the competitiveness of each district has not changed. And I think it's a really important thing to look at. First of all, in terms of where the districts are, how competitive they are, we have 5 competitive districts. Following the 2011 redistricting, all 5 districts of these competitive districts were held by Republicans. All right. And then in 2016, Josh Gottheimer won the 5th district race, making it 7 Dems and 5 Republicans. Then in 2018, Democrats astonished all forecasts, including 538, by winning all 4 remaining competitive districts, although we didn't keep one for long, thanks to a turncoat called Van Drew. But I want to thank 11 for Change and Blue Wave and other groups. We worked really hard to change those districts. It's not because of the map. The map was Republican, meaning that what they did is they packed in Democratic areas. You know, so you had 90% in Hudson, and in Essex, in District 10, you had 90% for the Democrat. And then in other areas, and even Cologne's getting 70%. And then they had Republicans in more of the competitive districts. Well, we changed that. We flipped it. Now, what could be the impact of redistricting? We kept all of our districts in 2020, which was quite a feat. Right. So in 2022, what's going to happen? That's the question. And I want to take another map. I don't want you to look at it for accuracy. This is simulations that were done actually on a form that you can all use, Dave's redistricting app. This is what 538 used when they did these simulations. And that's available and it's in the chat if you want to download it to try your own simulations, which I hope you will. But if you actually look here, what I want to talk about is how different criteria that they looked at affects the competitiveness of the district. All right, and the eventual number of Democratic and Republican seats. So you can see they underestimated, they thought that in 2018, we would end up, Democrats would end up with 8 seats. when we actually ended up with 11 that turned into 10 when Van Drew became a Republican. But they were predicting less than 8 given the current Republican map. So given where we are, if we had Republican gerrymandering, what would that do to our congressional delegation? Well, if they pick the Republican map, and as I said before, what's interesting about our bipartisan commission is it ends up being one map or the other. It's not where you have a supermajority like in California, where it has, and in many other states where you have to have more than just the majority. In New Jersey, it's equal, and then usually the tiebreaker picks the map, and it's either the Republican or Democratic map. And so if the Republican map is picked, we could lose Tom Malinowski's district. Right, we barely won it by just over 1%. Democrats did in 2020. It was a very close race. Tom Kane Jr. is running again and trying to amass some money to go against Tom Malinowski again. So that is going to be the most competitive race. And the Republicans would love to put in more Republican districts within Tom. That's going to be a little bit hard. And that's why I went to the first map. I'm going to go back. But before I do, I just want to look here. If you look at what are we talking about here, basically two seats. So if you go through with Republican gerrymandering, you could lose 1 or 2 seats. Now, you can look at the national scene and you know that we do not have the leeway to lose even 1 seat on the national scene. So Democrats need, if they're going to keep the House, which many have written off, I have not written off, but many have. And if we're going to keep it, we've got to keep all our New Jersey seats and maybe pick up a New Jersey seat. That's going to be a hard task. I'll explain why in a minute. But if you look at the actual map again, you can see that if down here, this is Van Drew's district, this is Andy Kim's district, and this is Smith's district, and this is Norcross's district. Now, if you look at the census results, we lost in these districts, we lost, especially Van Drew's population, right? This, Andy's, part of Andy's, which is the Republican part of Andy's, plus Smith's district, which is largely Ocean County. Ocean County won population. They increased their population, as did Essex County in the Payne's district, and Hudson County especially. Now, where will that extra population go? It's going to have to leave the Hudson County's district and the 10th district of Payne's district. So Payne is going to shed some individuals. It can go to Mikey Sherrill's. She could pick up a few, or Tom. Or there could be Hudson, could go to some of Josh's district from the Democratic map, right? So we could shore up Andy's district by taking some from Essex County, if they did. If the Republicans were making the map, they would put it down to one of these already blue. They would just pack it in a blue district if they could, right? For the extra, and probably give some to Mikey that would make hers more secure and try to make Tom's less secure. But if you look at the surrounding area, that would be hard. You could take some over from Josh's district. All of this over here is very Republican. And that could be put in Tom's district, which is the 7th, right? This is the 5th here. And then you would take part of basically Hudson County and put it up in Josh's district, or some in Pasquarel's. All right, so that I'm looking at where you would take the people. It's harder down here. And there's limits on the amount of gerrymandering you can do in these districts because of the question of connectedness between the districts. And you can't take one here and one somewhere else. All right, that's all I'm going to say on that.
Thanks very much, Marcia. So a big question here in NJ11 for Change and our co-sponsor groups is, what do we do? What can we do about it as members of the public? I think, Matt, you had some interesting thoughts and plans for what we can do to make ourselves useful and making sure that this whole process is what it needs to be.
Yes, and I'm going to go super, super fast because I know that we are low on time. So first, just everyone needs to know that because of the census delay, this is going to be a shorter process. The processes are going to be on top of each other. Again, we have two commissions. There's a Congressional Redistricting Commission, also the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. Both of them are really important. Like your state government and your federal government are both extremely important to your lives. Right now, honestly, the state government of New Jersey is probably having a bigger impact on responding to the crises that we're all facing. So both need to be paying attention to. Both of them are going to be having public hearings. It's the primary way you can influence this process is by attending a public hearing. They also said they're going to be accepting written testimony. They're going to be accepting maps. If you want to submit your draw and submit your own map, provide testimony of why that can be. Do that. But yeah, the biggest thing we need to know is you need to make your voice heard. Your voice heard of what you think your community could be. Because again, the moving people from district to district to satisfy the parties, to satisfy what we want politically is one thing, but you need to ask people in those communities where they feel they fit. That's what we think. And we would like you to be able to tell the commission, tell the apportionment commission, where you feel you fit, where you feel your community is, because that's what we want these maps to represent, is the actual grassroots feeling of where people believe themselves home. So there's actually a lot of like really good studies out there in the 2010 cycle that says that commissions, even commissions that did gerrymandering, people who made a lot of public comment, places where there were a lot of submissions of testimony, those actually did move the maps. They do listen, particularly potentially in a state like New Jersey, where it's the commissioners are political and are going to want to run for office again. If you show them you were paying attention, if you show them that you want something from them, and that you believe that they are going to be held accountable if they draw a map to suit themselves and not to suit communities, we think they'll listen. So they haven't released when those public meetings are happening yet, but they will be. Pay attention to that. We are going to have a website at the New Jersey Institute, at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice on redistricting that's going to have the list of public hearings. We're going to be running trainings to provide public testimony so you can feel confident doing it. But that is the way that you can get involved and really make a difference, is by telling them what you think and telling them where you think your community is and telling them what map you think makes sense. Oh, and also draw your own map. Dave's redistricting software has been mentioned. DistrictR is another one. They're great free tools that you can go and check out. And they'll tell you if you fit those criteria that we're talking about. Are your districts equal, like equipopulation? Are your districts VRA compliant? Things like that. Well, did you have to be quick? Get involved. Get involved. We don't have a lot of time.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I want to introduce Stacey Abenstein, who has been keeping her eagle eye on the questions in the chat, which she can now share to our panelists. Hi, Stacey.
Well, I have one first. So, Marcia, you had said that that we'll either pick the Republican map or the Democratic map, the tiebreaker person. So why do they not hash it out district by district and do one that everyone could be happy with?
I don't know that. They don't work district by district in general. They come up with maps that satisfy, equal distribution of population, and then the other criteria they're looking for, and they come up with separate maps. That's been the case. But go argue So I wanted to say, in terms of getting in front of the commission, state your case. Makes a government for the people and by the people by making sure your voice is heard. And while I was talking about, I want to say the macro approach earlier, I also want to say it's really important that your concerns. Do you live in Montclair? Do you think it should be split? Do you think it should not be split? Tell them, all right? If you live in another community and you have concerns, you don't want to be put in another district. You want to make sure that the districts stay the same, or a community of interest, right? Of like people, and you want to stay there. Get up and testify, something that means something to you. Also, draw the map, right? Play with it and present them. The tiebreaker for the congressional said, you know, give us your maps, right? Give us your testimony. You can submit it. So I would suggest doing all of the above.
Yes, Dave's Redistricting is a great website, but I got to tell you, it's not quite as easy as it looks. If you fix one problem, you create another. So
True.
I just wanted everybody to, it's a great idea to go onto that website and play around, and you'll see. And like you might fix compactness, and then the racial part is off, or the parties are off, or you know, it's quite difficult. There was another question in the box. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I think what's also interesting is that even within the same town or the same community, there might be different interest groups. So, you know, there might be, you know, groups in Montclair that want Montclair to be unified within a congressional district, but there may be sub-communities within Montclair that prefer to stay separate because it increases their influence and their interests, which may be different from the wider Montclair community. So I think, you know, there may well be no perfect solution that pleases everyone equally well. And it's good to be sensitive to what other adjacent communities to yours, or communities that you're tangential to, or, you know, Venn diagrammed with are.
I think that's a very important. As I mentioned, there are some conflicting criteria, and it's really important. Communities of interest, communities of color, that they're represented, and that the community of interest feel comfortable within their community. Those things are important. But I'm saying, go make your voice heard. That's the important thing. You know, state your preferences.
Right, and in the Montclair example, right, the southern chunk of Montclair, which is the portion of Montclair that has the highest Black population, may have more in common with the communities that I mean, the voters there, the residents there may want to be, you know, more in a district that has a higher Black population rather than the 11th, which has, I think, one of the highest white populations. So I think there's, you know, there are going to be concerns, right? They may say, I have more in common with, you know, Verona, and actually, I don't know if Verona might be in the 11th, but I have more in common with East Orange or Maplewood than I do with Sussex County, right? So I think there are lots of factors at play. And I also want to say on the map drawing, it is hard, right? There's a reason why it's tricky. There's been lots of citizen map drawing sort of movements across the nation. Pennsylvania in particular, I think, has a really robust citizen map drawing movement. And so, you know, it is hard, but that's part of why the exercise is helpful. It's like participatory budgeting or other kinds of small d democratic reforms that allow you to sort of see how the sausage is made and see like, oh, this is actually really challenging. It's not easy to just say like, well, let's keep Montclair united, because we might not be able to.
I wanted to share a comment that came through from Hanal Patel of New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She wrote, I think it's important to remember that there's more at stake than the parties. It's definitely an important factor, but the most important part of redistricting is for communities to have districts that let them elect candidates of their choosing. Our maps have consistently overrepresented white communities, and it's important to no longer do that.
Absolutely.
I just want to say that's a very good point for everyone to realize. And one of the, I think, our strongest criteria, which should be the protection of communities of color, right? Because they are underrepresented.
One thing I did want to flag, and this is something that's come up nationally, which is historically the only way to get Black or Hispanic representation in Congress was to have those districts be majority minority. Or I guess minority is the wrong term now at this point, but majority Black or Hispanic. And at this point, that doesn't necessarily appear to be the case, right? Lucy McBath represents a largely suburban district in Georgia. Andy Kim represents a district with like 5 Asians in it. So like, there are situations now where the kind of heavy concentration of Black and Hispanic voters that were required in order to have effective representation in Congress. I don't necessarily know if that threshold is where it has been historically. We're seeing more Black and Hispanic statewide elected officials in a variety of states. So, I think there's some, it is complicated.
We have 2 senators that are minorities.
Yeah, community interest and representation don't always, you can be a white district and choose to elect a Black representative you feel speaks to your needs. You can be a Black district and choose to represent a Black majority district and choose to represent a white elected that speaks to your needs. The core is that we want to make sure that we are drawing districts that allow those groups to be able to articulate their needs in a consistent way. And also to some of the things that people are putting in the chat, we don't know the public hearing dates yet. I know the Institute will put those dates on our website when we know them. I assume that probably all the groups here will do the same, but they haven't released them yet. The Institute has been pushing them to release them as soon as possible and to let us know when they will be inviting people in. I think we are expecting them to start in October, but they have not released them yet. And we will let you know. I'm sure all of us will let you know as soon as possible.
Matt, I'm sorry if I missed this while I was scanning the chat for questions. Did you discuss, or do you want to discuss training that might be available for people who are interested in giving testimony in public meetings, so that those of us who get tongue-tied can sort of prepare ourselves to be effective?
Yeah, we haven't yet finalized training, but again, we're going to have a website, which we had prepped before this meeting, we would share with you. If we don't yet, because everything is still on the fly. But we're going to have webinar trainings to provide public testimony. So to train people on doing that, as well as some worksheets that are available, materials we've pulled from other states and other best practices all over the country. So there will be ways for you to get yourself ready if you are someone who's nervous of providing public testimony. This is honestly, it should be something that we can all speak to, because it's speaking to where we live and our communities and what we view our communities are. So it's not a super intense training, but the materials will be available sometime shortly for you to check out. So I'll share that website when it's available, and we can share it with all participants.
Thank you.
I wanted to say the Brennan Center also has suggestions for testifying. So if people want to look at the Brennan Center website on redistricting, they do have suggestions for testifying.
Thanks. Stacy, are there other questions that you want to share with us?
Yeah, there was a question early that asked about how a citizen commissioner, board would be formed if we wanted to do a better job at having fair maps drawn.
Look at Colorado that just redid theirs. Look at California. There are many examples. What amazes me is how many Democratic states believe in fair districts, that the people actually believe in small d democracy, and they're looking at ways to implement it. So the important thing is to include citizens in the redistricting and to have a supermajority for the map to go through. So it's not just Republicans and Democrats, there's independents, there's independent citizens, as well as other parties that are allowed in. And you have minority representation, you have diverse representation on the committees. So check out what other states do. As I said, particularly there's been a trend towards nonpartisan commissions, which everybody should try to emulate. Unfortunately, we don't have that in New Jersey. I would love to see that change. I think that has been a big problem for ignoring the public and the public wishes, is the type of commissions we have.
Yeah, and I noted in the chat, but I'll just flag that many of the states that have independent citizen commissions were created by ballot initiative and referendum, which New Jersey does not have.
No.
So, any change would have to be constitutional, which would require, the legislature, which I'm sure it's not going to be easy to say, hey, group that currently controls the process, want to give it up and give it to somebody else. So, I mean, it's notable that so many of these have been in initiative and referendum situations. But I'm also going to put a link in the chat, which describes how all of the state commissions are selected. So you can take a look. There's a variety. Michigan, I think, also has a very interesting commission selection process.
Iowa does too. It's strange, but it's the strangest of all the states. Anyway, a lot of variety out there.
Marcia,
In the chat.
go ahead, Matt.
Just one of the questions in the chat. Yes, it would require a constitutional amendment, which has to be proposed through the legislature, or require a constitutional convention to rewrite the whole thing.
With so many elements of the process that seem to be out of our hands. I know, Marcia, you were speaking before about really what kind of strong impact it does have when members of various communities testify at these commission hearings. Can you talk a little bit about that and your experience in past
Well,
processes?
the legislature tried to push through their redistricting a couple of years ago, I think 2 or 3 before the pandemic. It was at least 3 years ago. And all of the activists went. We testified. The Republicans were against it. The activists were against it. It didn't represent good government. And it made a difference. They dropped it. There was so much negative press about what they were doing, right, that it caused them to drop it. So we have to unify. We have to get together. We have to say, this is wrong. And we have to testify, whether it's in Trenton, whether it's before the commissions. But we need to testify, and we need to demand that a constitutional amendment is written. And we've got to demand it from our friends in the legislature and the people that are not our friends. But we need to demand a citizen commission, and at least one that we could say has 5, 5, and 5, 5 independent, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. And where politicians cannot serve on it, existing politicians, right? That to me is the minimal, right? We should demand 6 to 12 public hearings for each commission, right? It shouldn't be, well, we're going to give you more than 3, so be happy, right? We need to demand that they actually put the rules. They also demand that it's nonpartisan, etc. So that even though you have Democrats and Republicans, that the commission itself does not favor incumbents.
So in that vein, if HR 1, S1 ever passes, will it have impact on these districts, or not for the next 10 years?
Not for the next 10 years.
I had a feeling that was.
I don't want to say if somebody else would say something. Matt, you want to say anything on that one?
Matt, any thoughts on that, on if HR1 comes through?
I think we have to see what the compromise bill looks like Very passes. And my previous job, my previous job was something I was working on. I know that it'll depend on what comes out, the effective date, and a lot of those things.
You
And it will
said,
almost certainly be subject to litigation instantly. So, you know, who knows what kind of effect it would have, how the courts will carve parts out of it. You know, whether they'll say that a ban on partisan gerrymandering is inherently unconstitutional, which they might, right? Like, who knows? It could be a lot of things. So, there's a good constitutional argument. I mean, like Article 1 does say that they can regulate districts. I think there's a good legal argument for it. But yes, the current Supreme Court. I was going to say, have you seen the Supreme Court lately?
Cite it's someone in 1664 did something.
Right. So basically what you're saying is we need to work on New Jersey.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean,
And I'm for that, absolutely.
So speaking of New Jersey and local, you know, members of NJ 11 for Change are very much focused on what happens with CD 11 and our borders. And a couple questions came through that are related to that. One of them was, you know, with the decline in population in Sussex County, any speculation about how that's likely to affect their inclusion in CD 11? Also, another question came in asking about, you know, our adjacent district, the 10th, and just having the 10th continue as an intensively minority district. Does that constitute packing? And how do we factor all that into what the future of CD 11 is likely to be?
Those are several different questions. Sussex County is part of Josh's district, and it lost population, but they could, I mean, Josh could increase his percentage of Bergen, maybe. Then
And
there's,
there is some Sussex in CD 11. We've got our five.
you've got the 5, but that means that you're going to have to take some maybe from 10th district. Payne will have to shed population because the district grew.
and they may decide to stick Malinowski with some of, I think I said Lance in the chat. My brain is still broken, I guess. Malinowski might just get stuck with some of Sussex in order to make his district losable and to shore up other districts for Dems, if in a Dem map, right? Whereas, you know, Republicans might also try to spread out a little bit of Sussex to sink all 3 of the sort of borderline districts, 5, 11, and 7. So it could go a lot of different ways, but for Dems, Sussex is a hot potato they don't want. And so the 3 of them will try to pass it off to each other as much as possible.
I don't think you can, you got to look at the actual populations and loss of populations. I mean, there's a limit on what you can transfer, you know, per district. So Republicans are going to want to give part of Sussex to Malinowski, right? However, they're going to have to shift population south anyway because the growth is in the north and it's in the Democratic areas. So it's very difficult to actually do what they're saying. So, I mean, I think that they will try, but I don't believe the Democrats would take a map where they lose 2 or even 1. They would want some compensation if they were going to lose 1 to gain 1. Right.
Thank you. Stacy, are there other questions that that we haven't hit yet? I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're getting towards.
I think we got to most of them, but I want to remind everybody that if you go into the chat box and at the bottom, at the very right, there are 3 dots. If you would like to change, you know, save the chat, which has a lot of great links, you just click that and save the chat because there's really so much information here.
Terrific. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention, I know we're focused on congressional redistricting, but there's also state legislative redistricting, which is going through a totally separate process. But for, you know, for a lot of folks that will matter a lot as well. And so want to make sure you folks are keeping an eye on both the congressional redistricting and the state legislative redistricting stuff.
And I just want to point out that Terry in the chat is pointing out that Parker Space is his representative as well as Mikey. So he's, I mean, and that exactly goes to it. It's like he's represented by someone he really doesn't want to be represented by. And then also by Mikey Sherrill. So yes, state, I'm all about the legislative redistricting as well. It's really important.
Yeah. So Matt,
From what I've heard, the New Jersey Democratic electives are also particularly concerned about the legislatives as their main. That's the people who are on these commissions are really concerned about the legislative and less concerned about the congressional, even though we might be more concerned about the congressional and less concerned about the legislative, because the people who got to pick the people who went on these commissions, they're the legislative reapportionment commission. So that's the one they really care about, which also means that's the one we really need you to turn out to as well.
Yes.
Because you could really see some shady backdoor stuff coming in for those unless we pay attention.
I think we should have another session on the state legislature, just possibilities on that, on the redistricting, because it is, there are a lot of options discussing different, you've got 40 districts, and the question is, what will happen in each district? And they've got to deal with the population changes on those districts, right?
it's certainly no end of convoluted and Byzantine processes going on here. So is there anything that that you'd like to say in closing, Matt, Peter, Marcia, anything we haven't hit upon that's really important for everyone to know kind of right now as we're watching the beginning of this process?
And I mean, I don't have anything new to share, but just to read again, I'm going to hit the same points over and over. This thing is about power. We want to make sure these next maps center racial equity in a state that has really changed. And we really need people to get involved, because the worst outcomes occur when people are not paying attention. But if you are involved and you are watching and you are participating and providing public comment, that's going to keep us away from the worst maps that we're afraid of. So that's, if you are worried about this process, find a way to get involved. There's not a lot of time. The next 10 years are going to be decided in like the next 6 months. So get involved.
Thank you.
I'll just add that it's important to be involved in the process for a variety of reasons, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean that you should be afraid of it, because all due respect to all of the members of the commission, there's not like some giant intelligence leap between you and the commissioners, nor is there some sort of giant expertise leap between you and the commissioners in terms of like how much knowledge you have of these maps. It can be learned. Okay, all of this can be learned. And really the most important thing is what you already know, which is like, what community do you consider yourself a part of, and how do you want to be represented in the legislature, right? Like that's what's important. And so there's a lot of technical aspects to this, ideal district size and packing and cracking and all of these terms that we're throwing at you. But like at the end of the day, it's about, how do you see your community, right? And how do you see that community being represented? And that's what's important to share.
Thank you, Peter. Marcy, any closing words?
Yes. Just, I want to say to everyone, stay involved, testify about your concerns, about your community, what you would like to see. We should have something again for the state legislature, because Matt, you're right. That's what Sweeney cares about. That's what a lot of the leaders care about. And we need to have an education session on that too. But I really think that we can make a difference. It's not always easy, but we can make a difference if we work together and we attend the public sessions, we testify, and we inform each other. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Marcia, Matt, Peter, really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. And thanks to our co-sponsors, Blue Wave New Jersey, Good Government Coalition of New Jersey, Soma Action, and Essex Rising. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this discussion and learned as much as we did. This is such an important topic. This is going to affect the next 10 years of governmental representation in our state. If you value events that educate voters about civic issues like this, please do support Defending Democracy, our panel series, by donating at our website, nj11.org. The link is up at the beginning of the chat. And we'll be putting a recording of tonight's panel on the NJ 11th for Change website later this week. It'll also be up on YouTube and it will be on our Facebook pages. We encourage you to share it with members of your community because we really feel this is important for all voters to understand because it really has a fundamental effect on our lives. So thank you again for joining us, everyone, and good night.